Hello again. Since some viewers are keen on the idea of Jews controlling the transatlantic slave trade, but unfortunately know nothing at all about history, I thought that I'd make them a free gift of a case where Jews really did control the slave trade, although it's not the one which everybody is familiar with, that between Africa and the Americas. It is sometimes asserted today that the transatlantic slave trade was dominated in the 18th and 19th century by Jewish merchants. This isn't true, but no such uncertainty attaches to the role of Jews in the medieval slave trade, which largely involved the export of white slaves from Europe to North Africa. The reason for this is not difficult to ascertain. It's an interesting story which also shows how the transatlantic slave trade itself began. For 1,000 years or so, Christian Europe was at odds with the Muslim world of North Africa and the Middle East. Invasions took place in both directions. At one time the Muslim armies swept across the Pyrenees into France, and then a few centuries later European armies converged on the Middle East and occupied much of it, setting up Christian kingdoms in Jerusalem and other places. 400 years later, Muslim armies were marching through Europe and only halted at the gates of Vienna. All these military activities were, at least nominally, motivated by religious fervour. The desire to convert unbelievers to the one true faith of, depending upon one's origins and skin colour, either Islam or Christianity. It followed as a matter of course that Muslims travelling through Italy and France were viewed askance, in just the same way that Christians in Syria and Algiers would be. Jews, not being bound to one side or the other, could often travel and trade more freely. It was accordingly far easier for a Jew to transport slaves to Venice or Verdun and then on to Africa than it would be for a Christian. As early as the late 5th century AD, a pope gave permission for Jews to bring non-Christian slaves into Italy, from where they were then sent to North Africa. Pope Gelasius was appointed pontiff in 492 AD, and from the first year of his reign was happy to see Slavs and Germans brought south en route to Africa. This was the beginning of extensive Jewish involvement in the slave trade. Within a century or two, the Jews were accepted as being the chief slave traders between Europe and Africa and the Middle East. A large part of their trade was in young men who had been brought to southern Europe to be castrated and then sold to Arab markets as eunuchs. In the late 9th century, the Arab writer Ibn Qudaba was giving a detailed account of the routes which were being used by those trafficking in slaves. In his book, called the Book of Roads and Kingdoms, he gave a detailed and precise account of who was behind the trade and how they moved their goods to and from Europe. Most of the slaves were bought by Jewish traders in what is now Russia, Ukraine and the Balkans, and then taken to Venice or Verdun to be operated upon. As director of posts and police for a province of the Abbasid Caliphate, Ibn Qudaba was in the best possible position to know about such things. The traders whom he wrote of were the Radhanites, a guild of Jewish merchants about the origin of which there are a number of theories. What is certain, though, is that the Radanites were an international business who travelled across Europe, Asia and Africa, dealing in luxury goods of high value. These men were multilingual and had bases across the whole of the known world, from Western Europe to the Far East, from northern Russia to Africa. To quote Ibn Qudaba, these merchants speak Arabic, Persian, Roman, Frankish, Spanish and Slav languages. They journey from west to east, from east to west, partly on land, partly by sea. They transport from the west eunuchs, female slaves, boys, brocade, castor, marten and other furs and swords. As we've seen, the Slavs were mostly heathens, that is to say they were neither Christians nor Muslim. As such, they were regarded as fair game by anybody who could catch them and take them from their homes. Russia and the Ukraine were good sources of Slav slaves, and so were the Balkans, which were also populated largely by Slavs. Our modern word slave, by the way, is of course derived from the word Slav. Bosnia was especially convenient, for it had a coastline on the Adriatic Sea, a short journey by ship from Venice. The slave trade from Bosnia flourished for centuries, coming to an abrupt halt in 1463 when the Ottoman Empire invaded and occupied the area. The loss of this important source of slaves was compensated by the opening up of a new and larger, indeed seemingly inexhaustible supply elsewhere. At about the same time that the Ottomans were taking over the Balkans and closing it off to European slave traders, the Portuguese were starting to exploit West Africa in a serious way. It was during the 16th century that the slave trade between Europe and Africa really took off. By 1540, some 12,000 slaves a year were being imported into Europe by the Portuguese. In Lisbon, the capital city, 10% of the population were enslaved Africans. Who needed Bosnia, or indeed any Slavs, when Africa was apparently able to supply any demand at all? I think that I've now pretty well exhausted this subject, and I'll leave it for a while. In the description to this video may be found references which will enable anybody interested to follow up on this and find out more about it.